October 26, 2025, South China Sea, 230 kilometers northeast of Indonesia's Great Natuna Island. The USS Nimitz, America's oldest nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, was conducting routine flight operations when at 14:45 local time, an MH-60R Seahawk helicopter suddenly lost power and went down into contested waters claimed by Beijing. All three crew members were pulled from the sea. Safe, stable, routine accident. Except 30 minutes later, an FA-18F Super Hornet fighter jet also crashed during flight operations from the same carrier. Both aviators ejected. Both were rescued. 5 American servicemen survived what could have been catastrophic failures. But 2 aircraft from the same carrier strike group, both going down within 30 minutes of each other in the most geopolitically sensitive waters on Earth? That is not routine. That is not a coincidence. And when President Donald Trump suggested contaminated fuel as the cause while flying aboard Air Force One the next day, ruling out foul play but acknowledging the situation was very unusual, the world began asking the questions that matter. Was this simply an accident? Could it have been sabotaged? Or was something far more calculated happening on China's doorstep during the final deployment of America's most legendary warship? The answers are elusive. The implications are not. 2 aircraft, 1 deck, 30 minutes. The common denominator had to be upstream. The South China Sea is not water. It is a chessboard where empires measure their strength in steel and resolve. $3 trillion in global trade flows through these shipping lanes annually. Beneath the surface lie vast reserves of oil and natural gas. Above, fighter jets from 6 nations patrol overlapping territorial claims that defy international law and inflame nationalist fervor. China claims virtually the entire waterway, constructing artificial islands fortified with runways, radar installations, and surface-to-air missile batteries in defiance of a 2016 international tribunal ruling that rejected Beijing's expansive claims. The Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all assert competing sovereignty over scattered reefs, atolls, and submerged features that have become flashpoints for confrontation. And into this powder keg sails the United States Navy, asserting freedom of navigation, conducting surveillance, and reminding Beijing that American power projection does not require permission. The USS Nimitz arrived in the South China Sea on October 21, 2025, as part of Carrier Strike Group 11. The carrier had just completed a grueling deployment to the Middle East, responding to attacks by Yemen's Houthi rebels on commercial shipping and maintaining deterrence against Iran. Now, on what would be its final operational cruise before decommissioning in 2026, the 50-year-old flat top was conducting high-tempo flight operations, launching and recovering aircraft day and night, showcasing American naval aviation dominance in waters where Chinese warships shadow every movement and state media denounces every maneuver as provocation. The MH-60R Seahawk is a marvel of maritime aviation engineering. It is designed for anti-submarine warfare, surface surveillance, search and rescue, and vertical replenishment operations. Twin General Electric turboshaft engines provide redundant power. Advanced avionics, sonar systems, and torpedoes make it a lethal hunter of submarines and surface threats. The helicopter assigned to Helicopter Maritime Strike Squadron 73 call sign Battle Cats had undergone pre-flight inspections that morning aboard the Nimitz. Fuel samples were tested, engines were checked, rotor systems were evaluated. Everything was nominal. At 14:45 local time, with 3 crew members aboard, the Seahawk lifted off from the carrier's flight deck, ascending into humid tropical air. The mission was routine, a short patrol around the carrier strike group, maintaining situational awareness, ready to respond to any threat or emergency. But minutes into the flight, something went catastrophically wrong. Witnesses on the carrier's flight deck heard the engines sputter. The helicopter's nose dipped. Altitude dropped rapidly. The pilot transmitted a mayday call. Then, impact. The Seahawk hit the water hard, rotors still spinning, fuselage sinking. Carrier Strike Group 11 launched immediate search and rescue operations. A rigid hull inflatable boat was in the water within seconds. Another helicopter was airborne. Within minutes, all 3 crew members were pulled from the sea, alive, stable. transported back to the Nimitz for medical evaluation. The crash was sudden, violent, but survivable. 30 minutes. That is how long passed before the second aircraft went down. 30 minutes between the helicopter crash and the moment an F/A-18F Super Hornet, one of the Navy's most advanced multi-role fighter jets, also plunged into the South China Sea. The Super Hornet, assigned to Strike Fighter Squadron 22, call sign Fighting Redcocks, had launched from the Nimitz for routine flight operations. 2 aviators were aboard the twin-seat jet, conducting training maneuvers, maintaining proficiency, keeping the carrier air wings sharp and ready. The F/A-18F is a twin-engine powerhouse, capable of supersonic speeds and operating from carrier decks in conditions that would ground lesser aircraft. It is reliable, proven, battle-tested. Yet on this day, something failed. The exact sequence of events remains under investigation. But what is known is that both aviators ejected from the aircraft before it struck the water. Ejection seats fired, parachutes deployed. Both crew members descended safely into the sea. Search and rescue teams from Carrier Strike Group 11 were already mobilized from the helicopter crash. They reached the downed aviators quickly, pulling them from the water, transporting them back to the Nimitz. Like the helicopter crew, both were reported safe and in stable condition. 2 crashes, 5 survivors, 0 fatalities. By any measure, the rescue operations were flawless, but the question remained: how do 2 aircraft from the same carrier, operating under the same conditions, crash within 30 minutes of each other? On the flight deck, a fuels petty officer stared at his morning sample log. Numbers were clean, procedures were clean, and still 2 birds were in the water. He would replay that checklist for weeks. Fuel can explain failure. It does not explain 30 minutes. The U.S. Pacific Fleet issued a statement on social media shortly after the incidents. All personnel involved are safe and in stable condition. The cause of both incidents is currently under investigation. The language was measured, clinical, offering no speculation, no blame, no answers. But within hours, speculation erupted across global media, defense forums, and intelligence networks. 2 aircraft from the same carrier do not go down in rapid succession without a common cause. Mechanical failure? Possible, but statistically improbable for 2 different aircraft types with different systems and redundancies. Pilot error? Unlikely given the experience and training of Navy aviators and the fact that both incidents occurred during routine operations. Environmental factors? The weather was clear, visibility good, sea state moderate. That left 2 possibilities that sent chills through Pentagon corridors and raised alarms in the White House Situation Room. Either there was a systemic issue affecting multiple aircraft aboard the Nimitz, or something more sinister could be at play. Contaminated fuel, sabotage, cyber interference, or a combination of factors. The investigation would need to answer not just what happened, but whether the crashes were purely accidental or if something more deliberate was involved. President Donald Trump was en route from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, to Tokyo, Japan, aboard Air Force One when reporters asked him about the incidents. Trump had been briefed by senior military officials and was scheduled to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping in South Korea later that week, making the crashes a diplomatic minefield. When asked if he knew what happened, Trump replied carefully, "They are going to let me know pretty soon. I think they should be able to find out. It could be bad fuel. I mean, it is possible it is bad fuel. Very unusual that that would happen." When pressed whether he thought foul play was involved, Trump responded firmly, "No, I do not. They think it might be bad fuel. We are going to find out. Nothing to hide." The president's comments publicly introduced the contaminated fuel theory, a hypothesis that Navy investigators were already pursuing aggressively. 2 sources familiar with the initial investigation confirmed to defense journalists that contaminated fuel in the aircraft was a leading suspect in both crashes, though they cautioned that initial reports were far from conclusive. A complete investigation into the crashes could take months, involving forensic analysis of recovered wreckage, examination of fuel samples from the Nimitz and its supply chain, interviews with crew members, and review of maintenance records, flight data, and environmental conditions. JP-5 is the lifeblood of carrier aviation. It is the Navy's standard jet fuel for its sea operations, a kerosene-based fuel with a higher flash point than commercial jet fuel, making it safer to store and handle aboard ships where fire is an ever-present danger. The fuel is stored in massive tanks deep within the carrier's hull and distributed through a complex system of pumps, filters, and lines to aircraft on the flight deck. Before JP-5 ever reaches an aircraft, it passes through multiple layers of quality control. The fuel originates from Pentagon-approved sources around the world and is transported by military Sea Lift Command fleet oilers that trail aircraft carriers during deployment. Before being pumped aboard an oiler, the fuel is tested and filtered. Before being transferred to the carrier, it is tested and filtered again. And before being pumped into an aircraft, sailors conduct visual inspections and sample tests, checking for water contamination, particulates, and chemical composition. The system is designed with redundancy upon redundancy to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic failure that occurred on October 26th. So how could contaminated fuel slip through? There are several possibilities, none of them comforting. Water contamination is the most common fuel problem. If seawater enters the fuel supply through corroded tanks, faulty seals, or improper handling during at-sea replenishment, it can cause engines to lose power or fail entirely. Biological contamination is another threat. Microorganisms can grow in fuel tanks, creating sludge that clogs filters and fuel lines. Chemical contamination can occur if the wrong type of fuel is mixed into JP-5 or if additives degrade and form harmful compounds. And then there is the darkest possibility, intentional contamination, sabotage. The USS Nimitz is not just any aircraft carrier, it is the oldest nuclear-powered flat top in the United States Navy, commissioned on May 3, 1975, exactly 50 years before these crashes occurred. Named in honor of World War II Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz, the ship has served through the Cold War, the Gulf War, operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and decades of global power projection. It displaces over 100,000 tons fully loaded and carries a crew of more than 5,000 sailors and aviators. Nuclear reactors power the ship, providing virtually unlimited range and endurance, allowing it to remain at sea indefinitely, projecting American power without dependence on supply lines. But age brings vulnerability. After 50 years of service, the Nimitz has experienced wear, fatigue, and the inevitable degradation of systems that have operated under extreme conditions for half a century. The ship has undergone multiple refits, overhauls, and modernization programs, but it is still fundamentally a 1970s design operating in a 21st century threat environment. The decision to decommission the Nimitz in 2026 reflects both budget realities and the recognition that newer Gerald R. Ford-class carriers represent the future of American naval aviation. But sending the Nimitz on one final deployment to the South China Sea, into the heart of contested waters where China views American presence as provocation, was a calculated strategic message. The United States does not cede territory. The United States does not retreat. And even a 50-year-old carrier remains a formidable instrument of deterrence. Even an accident can be weaponized if you control the narrative. China's response to the crashes was carefully calibrated. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun addressed the incidents during a regular press briefing in Beijing, stating that China had noted relevant reports about the double crash. If the United States puts in a request, then China will provide necessary assistance on humanitarian grounds. But then came the message that mattered. I would like to stress that the military aircraft crashed during military drills in the South China Sea. The implication was clear. American military operations in waters claimed by China are inherently dangerous. Accidents will happen, and China stands ready to offer humanitarian assistance, subtly positioning itself as a responsible regional power while reminding the world that these incidents occurred in what Beijing considers its sovereign territory. Chinese state media went further, publishing editorials that framed American military presence in the South China Sea as the root cause of maritime security problems. The narrative was consistent. Frequent U.S. military deployments destabilize the region. Chinese military activities are defensive in nature, and any incidents, accidents, or confrontations are the direct result of American provocation. It was information warfare, waged not with weapons, but with words. shaping global perception to delegitimize American operations and legitimize Chinese territorial claims. The investigation into the crashes expanded rapidly. Navy officials ordered comprehensive fuel quality tests across the entire Nimitz supply chain. Samples were taken from the carrier's fuel tanks, from the fleet oilers that had recently resupplied the ship, and from shore facilities in Guam, Japan, and Malaysia where the Nimitz had taken on fuel during its deployment. Recovered wreckage from both aircraft was transported to specialized forensic facilities, where investigators would examine engine components, fuel lines, and any residue that might reveal the cause of the failures. Flight data recorders and maintenance logs were reviewed. Crew members were interviewed, and parallel investigations examined whether any external factors, environmental conditions, electromagnetic interference, or cyber intrusions could have contributed to the crashes. The Navy also quietly reviewed security protocols for fuel handling and storage, assessing whether sabotage was possible and what measures could prevent it. The stakes were enormous. If contaminated fuel was the cause, it raised questions about quality control, supply chain security, and the vulnerability of carrier operations to disruption. If sabotage was the cause, it meant an adversary had penetrated American military logistics in a way that could have killed 5 servicemen and destroyed 2 aircraft worth over $120 million combined. And if the crashes were the result of cyber interference or electronic warfare, it meant China or another adversary had developed capabilities to disrupt carrier aviation operations without firing a shot. A nightmare scenario for Pentagon planners. The timing of the crashes could not have been worse from a diplomatic standpoint. President Trump was in the middle of a high-stakes Asia tour, meeting with allies and preparing for his first face-to-face meeting with President Xi Jinping since returning to office on January 2025. The summit in South Korea was intended to address trade tensions, North Korea's nuclear program, and the fragile stability in the Taiwan Strait. Now, the crashes in the South China Sea added another layer of complexity. Would Trump confront Xi about potential Chinese involvement? Would he demand transparency and cooperation in the investigation? Or would he downplay the incidents to avoid derailing diplomatic progress? Trump's public comments ruling out foul play suggested the latter approach, signaling a desire to prevent the crashes from becoming a flashpoint that could spiral into military confrontation. But behind closed doors, American intelligence agencies were not ruling out anything. Signals intelligence monitored Chinese military communications for any indication of knowledge or involvement. Satellite imagery reviewed Chinese naval and air force movements in the hours before and after the crashes, and counterintelligence officials assessed whether any personnel aboard the Nimitz or within the fuel supply chain had been compromised, bribed, or coerced into sabotaging the carrier's operations. The broader context of the crashes cannot be ignored. The USS Nimitz was not operating in isolation. Carrier Strike Group 11 included multiple Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, each equipped with advanced radar, anti-aircraft systems, and ballistic missile defense capabilities. These ships were positioned to defend the carrier from air, surface, and subsurface threats. The fact that 2 aircraft crashed during routine operations with no indication of hostile fire, missile launches, or enemy contact suggested the threat came from within, not from external attack. But the South China Sea is a domain where gray zone warfare thrives. This is conflict below the threshold of armed engagement, where adversaries use cyber attacks, electronic warfare, disinformation, and covert sabotage to achieve strategic objectives without triggering a military response. If an adversary wanted to send a message that American carrier operations in the South China Sea are vulnerable, causing non-lethal but spectacular crashes would be an effective method. It creates doubt. It raises questions. It forces the United States to divert resources to investigation and damage control. Whether or not any foreign power was involved, the crashes achieved a strategic effect. They raised the perceived risk of operating in contested waters. They generated global headlines questioning American military readiness, and they provided Beijing with propaganda ammunition to argue that U.S. military presence in the region is destabilizing and dangerous. By October 28th, 48 hours after the crashes, preliminary findings began to emerge. Navy investigators confirmed that fuel samples taken from the Nimitz showed trace amounts of water contamination in certain tanks. The contamination levels were not extreme, but in turbine engines operating at high performance, even small amounts of water can cause power loss, engine surging, or complete failure. The question was how the contamination occurred. Initial analysis suggested it entered the supply chain during at-sea replenishment operations conducted days before the crashes. The Nimitz had taken on fuel from a military seal lift command oiler while operating in the Philippine Sea, and that oiler had itself been resupplied from a shore facility in Guam. Tests at the Guam facility showed no contamination, but the transfer process itself, conducted at sea in humid tropical conditions, created opportunities for seawater to enter fuel tanks if seals, valves, or hoses were compromised. China's state media continued to amplify the narrative that American military presence in the South China Sea is destabilizing and dangerous. Editorials pointed to the Nimitz crashes as evidence that U.S. carrier operations are reckless and that accidents are inevitable when foreign militaries conduct drills in waters claimed by China. The propaganda campaign was sophisticated, targeting international audiences in Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, with messaging designed to erode support for American military engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Beijing's strategy was clear. Use the crashes to delegitimize freedom of navigation operations, to frame Chinese military activities as defensive responses to American provocation, and to position China as the responsible regional power advocating for peace and stability. The information warfare dimension of the crashes was as significant as the physical incidents themselves. Narratives matter, perception shapes policy, and China's ability to control the global narrative around the crashes demonstrated the effectiveness of its propaganda apparatus in shaping international opinion. The U.S. Navy officially concluded its preliminary investigation in early November, releasing a carefully worded statement that attributed the crashes to fuel contamination introduced during its sea replenishment operations. The statement emphasized that there was no evidence of sabotage, no indication of hostile action, and no systemic failures beyond the localized fuel contamination. The 5 crew members had returned to duty after medical evaluations confirmed they suffered no lasting injuries. The wreckage of both aircraft had been recovered and would undergo detailed forensic analysis to confirm the preliminary findings. The statement ended with a commitment to implement corrective measures, improve quality control procedures, and ensure that similar incidents would not occur in the future. It was a carefully calibrated message designed to acknowledge the problem, demonstrate accountability, and reassure allies and adversaries alike that American carrier operations remain safe, effective, and resilient. But beneath the official narrative, questions lingered. Was the contamination truly accidental? Could adversaries have exploited vulnerabilities in the supply chain? And what other weaknesses exist in carrier operations that have not yet been exposed? November 12, 2025. Naval Base Kitsap, Washington State. Gray clouds hung low over the Puget Sound as tugboats guided the USS Nimitz through the channel toward its berth. Thousands of family members lined the pier, holding signs, waving flags, waiting for loved ones who had been at sea for 8 months. The carrier's return marked the end of an era, but for those who served aboard during the crashes, the homecoming was complicated, relief mixed with reflection, gratitude tempered by questions. They had survived, but they had also been part of an incident that raised doubts about American carrier readiness at a critical moment in geopolitical competition. The Navy conducted extensive debriefings in the weeks following the crashes. Every crew member involved in fuel handling, maintenance, and flight operations was interviewed. The goal was not to assign blame, but to identify systemic weaknesses and implement corrective measures. What emerged from these interviews was a sobering portrait of the challenges facing an aging carrier operating under intense operational tempo in a hostile environment. Sailors reported that fuel quality testing equipment aboard the Nimitz had experienced intermittent malfunctions during the deployment. Replacement parts were delayed due to supply chain issues. Maintenance schedules were compressed to meet operational demands, and the pressure to launch and recover aircraft on schedule sometimes led to abbreviated pre-flight checks. None of these factors alone caused the crashes, But collectively, they created an environment where small errors could compound into catastrophic failures. The Navy's investigation also revealed broader institutional challenges. The Military Sealift Command, responsible for transporting fuel to carriers at sea, had been operating with reduced manning and deferred maintenance due to budget constraints. Fleet oilers, the tanker ships that supply carriers, were experiencing higher than normal equipment failures, forcing them to operate with degraded capabilities. In shore facilities in Guam and Japan, critical nodes in the Pacific fuel supply chain had not received infrastructure upgrades in over a decade. The fuel contamination that caused the Nimitz crashes was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of systemic underinvestment in the logistics infrastructure that sustains carrier operations. The Pentagon recognized this reality and began accelerating funding for fuel system modernization, oiler fleet recapitalization, and shore facility upgrades. But these investments would take years to implement, meaning the Navy would continue operating with vulnerabilities that adversaries could exploit. The crashes served as a catalyst for change, but change in military bureaucracy moved slowly, constrained by budget battles, competing priorities, and the inertia of established procedures. The USS Nimitz completed its final deployment and returned to Naval Base Kitsap in Washington State in late November 2025. The carrier's homecoming was bittersweet. After 50 years of service, spanning generations of sailors, conflicts, and deployments, the Nimitz would soon be decommissioned, its reactors defueled, its hull eventually dismantled. The crashes in the South China Sea would be among the last significant incidents in the carrier's storied history. A final reminder that even the most powerful warships are vulnerable to the mundane failures of mechanical systems and human error. But the legacy of the Nimitz extends far beyond those final crashes. It is a legacy of deterrence, of power projection, of American commitment to defending freedom of navigation and supporting allies in the most contested regions of the world. The crashes were a footnote in that legacy, not a defining chapter, yet they serve as a lesson. Vigilance cannot be compromised. Systems must be maintained, and the margin for error in modern warfare is narrower than ever. The broader question remains unanswered. What really happened on October 26, 2025? Was it simply contaminated fuel, an unfortunate but explainable accident? Or could something more deliberate have been at play? A probe of American vulnerabilities, a demonstration of adversary capabilities operating below the threshold of war. The truth may never be fully known. Investigations can reveal what happened, but not always why. Evidence can show cause, but not intent. And in the gray zone between peace and war, where nations maneuver for advantage without crossing into open conflict, ambiguity is a weapon as potent as any missile or cyber attack. The crashes aboard the USS Nimitz are a reminder that modern warfare is not only fought with guns and bombs, it is fought with information, perception, and the exploitation of vulnerabilities that adversaries probe constantly, testing defenses, measuring resolve, and searching for weaknesses. The United States Navy responded to the crashes with professionalism, transparency, and a commitment to corrective action. But the question lingers: how many other vulnerabilities exist? How many other systems are quietly degrading, waiting for the wrong moment to fail? And how many adversaries are watching, learning, and preparing to exploit those failures when the stakes are higher and the consequences more severe? The South China Sea remains a flashpoint, a theater where great powers compete for influence, resources, and strategic advantage. The crashes of the MH-60R Seahawk and the FA-18F Super Hornet will be studied in classrooms at the Naval War College, analyzed in Pentagon briefings, and debated in defense journals for years to come. They will be examined as case studies in carrier aviation safety, fuel supply chain vulnerabilities, and the challenges of operating aging platforms in contested environments. But they will also be remembered as a moment of vulnerability, a crack in the armor of American naval dominance, and a warning that the next confrontation in these waters may not end with all personnel safe and in stable condition. The beast was wounded, not dead. And the next time, the outcome may be far more catastrophic. Vigilance is not optional. It is the price of freedom. And in the most dangerous waters on Earth, that price must be paid every single day, in every operation, by every sailor who stands watch while the world sleeps. The preliminary answer is fuel. The strategic question is timing. In the gray zone, doubt is a weapon, and it was used well. If you want reporting that cuts noise from signals, subscribe and stay with us. The next story begins long before anyone calls it an attack.